So I want to tell you about a book today. The book is called the Gulag Archipelago, and it's by a Russian author, a Soviet author named Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, who was in the Gulag Archipelago concentration camp system for a very long time. He had a very hard life. He was on the Russian front when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in the early stages of World War II. Now, Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact, and Hitler invaded the Soviet Union anyway. And from what I've been able to understand, the Soviets had prepared an invasion force for Europe at that point, but were not concerned with having to defend their territory, and so they were caught completely unawares by Hitler's move. And the conditions on the Russian front were absolutely dreadful, and Solzhenitsyn was a soldier on the Russian front. And he wrote some letters to one of his friends, which were intercepted, complaining about the lack of preparation and using bitter, dark humor to describe the situation. And the consequences of that was that he was thrown into a work camp. The Soviet system relied on work camps, and so those were large labor camps of people who were essentially enslaved, many of whom were worked to death, often froze to death, working in conditions that were so dreadful that they're virtually unimaginable. Solzhenitsyn spent a very large number of years in these camps, sometimes in a more privileged camp because he was an educated man, and sometimes in worse camps. He also developed cancer later. So he had a very hard life. There's just no way around that. To be on the front and then to be in a concentration camp and then to have cancer, that's pretty rough. In the early 1960s, Solzhenitsyn published a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was a story about one day in the life, his life really, inside one of these so-called Gulag Archipelago camps. Now, he called it the Gulag Archipelago because an archipelago is a chain of islands. And so Solzhenitsyn likened the work camp system in the Soviet Union, which was made up of isolated camps distributed across the entire state. He likened that to a series of islands, and hence the metaphor. And One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was one of the first publications released in the Soviet Union that dared make public what had happened inside these camps, at least initially. Now, that thaw didn't last very long, but that book had a tremendous effect. It's a short book, it's worth reading. After that, he wrote a number of other books, which are also, he's a great literary figure in the same category, I would say, as Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, which is like really saying something. You know, those two are perhaps the greatest literary figures who ever lived, with the possible exception of Shakespeare. He wrote this book called the Gulag Archipelago, which is published in 3 volumes, each of which is about 700 pages long. The first one details the origin of the oppressive Soviet system, at least in part under Lenin, and then its full-fledged implementation under Stalin, and the deaths of, well, Solzhenitsyn estimated the deaths in internal repression in the Soviet Union at something approximating 60 million between 1919 and 1959. Now, that doesn't count the death toll in the Second World War, by the way. Now, people have disputed those figures, but they're certainly in the tens of millions, and the low-end bounds are probably 20 million, and the high-end bounds are nearer what Solzhenitsyn estimated. He also estimated that the same kind of internal repression in Maoist China cost 100 million lives, and so you can imagine that the genuine historical figures, again, are subject to dispute, but somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. And one of the things that's really surprising to me, and that I think is absolutely reprehensible, is the fact that this is not widespread knowledge among students in the West, any of this, and it's because your education, your historical education, if you started to describe it as appalling, you would barely scratch the surface. These were the most important events of the 20th century, and they're barely covered at all in standard historical curriculum. You know of something, I would presume, about World War II and about the terrible situation in Nazi Germany and the death of 6 million gypsies and Jews and homosexuals in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. But my experience with students has been that none of them know anything about what happened as a consequence of the repression of the radical left in the 20th century. And I believe the reason for that is that the communist system had extensive networks of admirers in the West, especially among intellectuals, and still in fact does, which is also equally reprehensible. And I believe that one of the consequences of that is that this element of history has been what would you say, under-examined, and certainly very little attention has been brought to it in the public school curricula, and there's absolutely no excuse for that. It was the worst thing that happened in the 20th century, and that's really saying something, because the 20th century was about as bad as it gets. And so, and the fact that these deaths on massive scale occurred, and the fact that we don't know that deep inside our bones is a testament to the absolute rot of the education system. So Solzhenitsyn in particular laid at the feet of the Soviet citizenry the burden of the absolute catastrophes that characterized that system because of each individual's propensity or proclivity within the state to lie and deceive constantly about what they thought and what they said, and to be afraid to speak, and to be afraid to think, and to be afraid to criticize. And it was no wonder, because criticism, of course, was at least became an offense that was punishable by death. But these things start much more slowly than that, and they start with people abandoning their own identities and adopting a pathological group identity, well, for any number of reasons, but one of them certainly is their desire to shrink from individual responsibility and their desire for ready-made ideological solutions. Solzhenitsyn basically, he committed a huge part of the Gulag Archipelago to memory, which is really something, given that it's 2,100 pages long and printed in like 7-point font. And the book is written at an unbelievable level of emotional intensity. It's a 2,100 page scream. It's very, very intense. It's a very difficult thing to read, but it's absolutely crucial reading. It's actually now part of the curriculum in Russia, in high school, which also says something about Russian high schools compared to, say, North American high schools. Because I doubt if the typical North American high school student reads 2,100 pages of anything during their entire education in high school, and certainly not something like the Gulag Archipelago. Gulag, or G-U-L-A-G, or Gulag, is an acronym for a Russian term, Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps, the bureaucratic name of the governing board of the Soviet labor camp system, and by metonymy, the camp system itself. The word archipelago compares the system of labor camps spread across the Soviet Union with a vast chain of islands, known only to those who were fated to visit them. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the formation of the Russian Federation, the Gulag Archipelago has been officially published and included in the high school program in Russia as mandatory reading. Structurally, the text comprises 7 sections divided in most printed volumes into 3, parts 1 to 2, 3 and 4, and 5 to 7. At one level, the Gulag Archipelago traces the history of the system of forced labor camps that existed in the Soviet Union from 1918 to 1956, starting with Lenin's original decrees shortly after the October Revolution, establishing the legal and practical framework for a series of camps where political prisoners and ordinary criminals would be sentenced to forced labor. One of the things that's quite interesting about the Gulag camps, and this is something that's very relevant to understanding of modern Russia, is that ordinary criminals were put into the camps, and so were political prisoners. But the ordinary criminals, and so those would be rapists and murderers, let's say, as well as thieves who were engaged in theft as an occupation, those were regarded by the Soviets as socially friendly elements. And the reason for that was that they assumed that the reason that these people had turned to crime was because of the oppressive nature of the previous czarist/capitalist system, and that the only reason that these criminals existed was because they had been oppressed. They were oppressed victims of that system. And so one of the convenient consequences of that absolutely insane doctrine was that the Soviets put the ordinary criminals in charge of the camps. And these were very, very seriously bad people. And so you can imagine the way that they treated the political prisoners, who were regarded as socially hostile elements, sometimes because of their own hypothetically traitorous acts, but more often merely as a consequence of their racial or ethnic identity, or the fact that they were related by birth to, say, people who had been successful under the previous system, so who had any association with nobility or any association with what were known as the kulaks, who were the only successful class of former peasants in the Soviet Union, because they were regarded as privileged. You may have heard that word more recently. They were regarded as privileged and therefore as enemies of the state, and it didn't matter if it was your father or your grandfather or your great-grandfather who happened to be privileged, but the mere fact that you were a member of that group was sufficient reason to put you into a camp. And we're talking hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of people who underwent that fate. And so the idea in the Soviet Union was just because you were the member of a class, even as a consequence of your familial association, you were immediately sufficiently guilty to be put into a camp and punished. And the terms for the camps were often 10 years, 15 years long. And if you were very fortunate, you got to have 2 or 3 of those. So the Soviets really implemented and perfected the idea of class and ethnicity-based guilt. That's just how it is. You don't have to necessarily have done anything wrong for things to get completely out of control. It's a terrifying doctrine, but it's not a hopeless doctrine because it still says that there's a way forward, there's a pathway forward, and the pathway forward is to adopt a mode of being that has some nobility so that you can tolerate yourself and perhaps even have some respect for yourself as someone who's capable of standing up in the face of that terrible vulnerability and suffering, and that the pathway forward, as far as the existentialists are concerned, is by, well, certainly by the avoidance of deceit, particularly in language, but also by the adoption of responsibility for the conditions of existence and some attempt on your part to actually rectify them. And the thing that's so interesting about that is if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like?